Hey guys, I want to thank you for tuning in with another episode of Talking with Jess. And we're on location today. I'm actually in a comic book store, Gulf Coast Cosmos, and I'm here with the two owners. Why don't you guys introduce yourself?
Hey, my name is Byron Kennedy.
And I'm Charmaine Fury.
All right. And Mr. Kennedy, where are you from?
I am originally from Central Texas, but I grew up here in Houston, Texas.
Okay, Houston, Texas. And Charmaine, what about you?
I'm from Long Beach. I did grow up on and off in Texas. I lived in Kingsville, Austin, and now I'm in Houston. But yeah, I grew up in Long Beach.
Long Beach, California, the LBC.
The LBC,
Oh,
the West Side. And I'm resisting the urge. I'm grabbing my hands so I don't like throw my W.
There you go. Now, obviously, we're in a comic book store, a black-owned comic book store, which is amazing. Now, who came up with the concept of a comic book store?
Separately, simultaneously, but together.
There we go. I like that.
So
She did. He did.
we both when we met, we went through our business school. We were in an online master's program 10 years ago, and we met. We had an icebreaker session in our cohort, and I admitted that I was a comic book fan and that I do Muhammad Ali speeches. And then he liked that. And so we ended up...
it was the coolest thing.
We ended up reaching out to each other, and we kind of carried each other through our program. We worked on assignments together. We just stayed friends, both of us being comic book nerds. And I had probably said on and off throughout the years that it was kind of a dream to have a comic book shop because, growing up in Long Beach, where I lived on the north side, there wasn't anything for us, and...
Right. Same thing for me.
Yeah.
I think that any comic book fan, any comic book collector is like, in your mind, it is your fantasy to have a comic book store of your own. And so when the two of us found out that we just had this mutual love for comic books, our conversations that centered around comic books would typically revolve around what would your fantasy comic book store look like, be like, and what would you, all the stuff that we would do. And it eventually evolved into we.
Yeah.
And us, and wouldn't it be great if we...
Yeah. And always the key part for both of us was that we were black and brown people existing in what is assumed to be a white cis male fandom, full stop. Right. But we're out here living proof that you can be brown and comic book fan the whole time.
Right.
And it's also how we found ourselves sometimes. We there's not a whole lot of black Japanese families on TV or in movies, like not any that I've seen actually.
Yeah. And for me, growing up, I grew up in the suburbs, so during the time period that I grew up in, like the 70s and the 80s, the suburbs were predominantly white. So you being one of two black kids growing up in the suburbs, it was kind of like the raisins in like the rice, where you're having to constantly adjust yourself and still be okay with not seeing yourself in anything, that is considered quote unquote pop culture.
It's very interesting you brought that up, because now there seems to be a surge of representation. Everybody wants to be represented. And I've often said, do you want to be represented or do you want attention? Because you could very well be represented and depicted as a villain.
Sure.
You've still been represented, and and I've said this oftentimes, like they made an uproar not so long ago, but I think there was no black characters in the movie Frozen, and I was like, so I think if I'm not mistaken, the fictional place is supposed to take place somewhere like in Norse or
right,
someplace very cold where you probably wouldn't find any people of color. I'm like, well, they're not supposed to be.
Yeah, I wasn't hating that.
I was like, and, my daughters love Frozen. I'm like, but they're not supposed to be. It's not the region for it. But okay. Now, also, Mr. Kennedy, you are an educator. Is that correct?
That is correct. Yes.
Okay.
I am a professor at the University of Houston downtown. I teach marketing out of the College of Business.
Really?
Yeah.
Wow.
I've been there. This year is my 7th year, as a matter of fact.
Okay. So, college professor and a comic book nerd.
I check
here.
we out here. Like I check all the nerd, blurred, geek, tweet boxes.
But also a filmmaker.
Also a filmmaker.
You make film as well.
Yeah.
That's another layer of connection that we both have. We were both in the film industry, and the master's program we entered was an entertainment business.
Right.
So we wanted to convert our creative side into the business side, or like that's what got us to even meet. Yeah.
See, and I was actually a student at Full Sail University. Yeah, I know the look.
That's where we are at. That's where we met.
Yeah, and then for. I was going for communications, but they have it listed as, sports media, the Dan Patrick School of Sports Media. I'm like, yeah, enough said. I'm like, why?
I know enough about Dan Patrick. Where I'm going.
That's all I'm saying. Why am I like, this is not, excellent.
Yeah, well, we did the entertainment business masters at Full Sail. That's how we met.
Right.
Excellent. Have you ever been to the campus itself? I've been there once, man. It was like, it's a pretty nice campus, but most of my stuff has been online, so.
Right.
Yeah.
So, being an educator, and I'm sorry, before this, what did you do?
All the things. I was a director of HR in a tech firm for a long time, and then in my most recent HR position, I was at a private school in LA. And in addition to that, I am also a podcaster. So I have my own podcast company and 3 podcasts that I host. And then I produce a couple as well. And so, yeah, I do a lot. And I used to be a filmmaker. And I say used to, and I'm fine with that because I'm done. And, all
the things.
I did a lot.
Oh, wow.
I was a facilities manager at Dell for a long time. Yeah. I tried all the things.
We have a lot of connection there because obviously me doing this, I have our own media production company, Varsity League Media, and a lot of people think when you comes to podcasting or hosting, you just get behind the camera and start talking. And you're going to be an instant overnight celebrity. All I need is 1 million views. It's very hard to create content and captivate somebody's attention, especially if they find you boring or dull, or it's not the cliche celebrity gossip and so forth.
Yeah, there's ways I could have made money way easier than the stuff I'm doing.
Yeah.
The stuff I'm doing is all representation. I have a mixed race podcast, I have a black nerd podcast, and I have a queer podcast. And it's like, I'll take my little $20 donation here and there, but...
So go ahead, shout out your podcast. Let them know.
So I am the host of Militantly Mixed, the podcast about race and identity from the mixed race perspective. I am a co-host of Blurred Comics, a podcast about blackness and blurred shit from a couple of mixed black blurs, and I am co-hosted with a childhood friend of mine, Blurred Vision, and Bifurious podcast, which is a LGBTQ podcast for angry queers. Angry brown queers.
So, with you saying that, obviously, are you of mixed race?
Yeah, I'm black and Japanese.
Okay, because you had mentioned it before, and I didn't want to say anything, but I was like, her facial features, like, you can tell.
Yeah. I don't act like people don't know. Well, correction. I don't act like black people don't know. Black people usually can always tell that I'm black. Japanese people cannot tell I'm Japanese, and more than anything, if I tell them, "Watashi wa Yongo-ni-ichi Nihonjin desu," which is I am mixed with Japanese, and they'll be like, "Funny." So I'm very rarely I'm very rarely seen even as East Asian. Sometimes people think I'm I'm either Puerto Rican, Dominican on the East Coast, or I'm Filipino or Mexican on the West Coast. Here I'm Creole or black, and it's fine.
Yeah, you know what? I'm gonna be honest with you. That happens a lot now, because I remember when I got stationed in Camp Lejeune, North Carolina, like fresh-faced 18-year-old, everybody had a fresh haircut in the Marine Corps, and like. I would just sit in the laundry room, get ready to wash my clothes, and some guy started walking up to me, started speaking Spanish, and I'm like, "What?" And I looked over at my other buddy.
He started speaking
He started speaking Spanish to my buddy, who was actually Hawaiian, and he looked at him and said, "What the hell is he talking about?" And he looked at us both and said, "Nobody equal." I'm like, "No, bro, I'm black. He's Hawaiian. Like, what are you doing?" He's like, "My bad."
I'll get Dominicans straight up yelling at me about, like, you are Dominican. Like stop denying it.
Yeah. Like, for a week straight, I was told I was Puerto Rican. Like, no, bro, I'm not.
I lived in Miami, and I was either Cuban or Haitian.
Yeah.
So, yeah. And I'm bilingual. So
Yeah, he speaks Spanish.
I speak Spanish.
I grew up in LA and I
You're
don't
a
speak
spy, is
Spanish.
what it is. You're a spy.
I'm a Cuban spy. Right.
Now, you've also mentioned you co-host a LGBTQ podcast as well. You know what I'm asking? I'm assuming you're a part of the LGBT community or supporter, or
I'm a B.
B. That's great. That's great. That's great. So yeah, I've tried to reach out several times with that community, those that want to talk about their issues, you know, in a safe environment as to where it's fair. Because, like, you know, I'm all about representation, but sometimes you stand back and look at things logically. It's like, okay, now you're being a bully, and that's with anybody.
Right.
You know, now you're picking on somebody, you know, for the sake of picking on somebody.
Right.
So, and that's never cool, man. We all have to accept each other's differences, and sometimes we can agree to disagree and keep calm and chive on.
Right.
And the thing is, with queer representation for brown folks, the most important thing is that we are always brown and queer at the same time. We can't divorce the two. So a lot of the mainstream LGBTQ representations out there, I don't see myself in, and I can't relate to it. And it doesn't matter that we might share an orientation, we are not the same. So when I created Bi Furious, the idea was that brown people who, you know, intersectional queer people could come and talk. I do have the occasional white person on the show, of course, because, you know, there are some crossovers, but I exist as a brown queer at all times, and so I can't separate those issues. I have to talk within both of those things.
Right.
And that's the way I do.
Now, all right, excellent. I look forward to talking to you more about that. Now, Mr. Kennedy, speaking with you before, you and your family, you said, are huge proponents for literacy and education.
Absolutely.
And we have to keep in mind, this is 2021, going to 2022. The way things were presented in the 70s, 80s, and 90s when it came to literacy is completely different now.
Yeah.
Most average kids, you talk to them, ask them what the Dewey Decimal System is or the card catalog, they'll look at you like, what are you talking about?
What is that?
What is that?
Can I Google it?
Yeah, can I Google it? And I remember some years ago, one of my oldest asked me, how did you do homework without the internet, without Wikipedia? I said, it was called an encyclopedia.
Right.
Yeah, in the reference section. I said, so.
I remember as a kid, it was like one of the things that I wanted for Christmas was the Encyclopedia Britannica. Yeah, I was that nerd.
Oh, that was when you had you ordered it through a magazine on a clip thing, you cut it out, and then you got a new book a month, new letter every month until you filled out that
full set. That was what I wanted for Christmas.
And trust
Nerd.
me, I can definitely understand, you know, where you're coming from, because when I started out going to school in Lake Charles, Louisiana, I grew up on the north side. My parents sent me to school on the south side, and it was like only in the entire school maybe 3 black kids there, and I was in kindergarten. I remember one of the older kids was like, hey, is your brother a 5th grader? I'm like, what? And I was like, what? And, you know, I had some friends here and there. Like, there was one little girl, she was always nice to me, but now as an adult, she has 3 black children, mixed race children, so I was like, I see. There was another guy, a friend of mine, he was pretty cool. He was nice to me as well, but I would get picked on and bullied and like into fights like every other week.
Yeah.
They beat me up sometimes because I was black. They beat the other guy up because he was a nerd, so mutual ass kickings make people friends. So, so how did that happen for you being, you said in the suburbs?
Yeah.
Obviously, you're a black guy, black kid. You like to read. You like comic books. Probably had interests that most people, you know, that look like you did not have.
Stereotypically,
exactly.
Were some of the interests that a lot of other black kids didn't have. Like I said, sometimes it was tough, especially when you come to the realization that you are quote unquote an other. I use a quoting James Baldwin. When you come to it comes as a great shock when you realize that the world that you live in does not include you. I'm just paraphrasing. But,
right.
It's shocking, and you sort of become unsettled in that period, and you realize the things that you love, like comic books and reading and science and all of those things don't, the narrative does not include you. And for me, personally, I was taken aback, and I was always on the defensive about it, but not in a bad way. It was just one of those things that it's like I felt was, it was my job, and it was kind of weird as a kid. It's like I felt it was my job to, just, change people's perspectives. That, look at my family, look at, my relatives. My parents, my father was an entrepreneur. He had his own business, and my mother was a creative. She worked in the business with my father. She was the manager of the business. My father was a dental technician, and he had a laboratory. I mean, you can't get any more nerdy than that.
Laboratory, I like that. A laboratory.
Here in the third ward.
Here in third ward. So that was, it was always a balance for me to come out on the weekends, me and my brother to come out on the weekends and hang with my dad in third ward, to go from predominantly white neighborhood to just door to door black excellence, just without question.
Right.
So that was the balance for me. Having that space.
Excellent.
Come and sort of decompress.
Now, you grew up in the 70s and 80s.
Mm.
I'm assuming you grew up in the 80s and in the 90s.
I'm from the 70s and 80s too.
Get out of here.
Black don't crack it, Asian don't raise it. I'm gonna be nice and smooth until I'm like 84, and then I'm just gonna hunch over and show
My gosh. You have just probably started a new catchphrase, because I've never heard that before in my life.
First time she said it, I was like, yo.
Wow. There you go. You heard it here first, talking with Jess.
Yep.
What are some of your earlier memories or earlier favorite comic book characters growing up?
I think it starts with Batman for a lot of people.
Number one in my book.
You can't help it. Like, first there was the '60s Batman show that continued to rerun even when we were growing up, and I have a deep love for Cesar Romero for not shaving his mustache as Joker, and he's just like, you just gonna just go ahead and comb that white makeup on top of my mustache. I thought he was just a crazy Joker, and so I think that probably starts it. And then Batman '89 comes out, the movie, and that probably solidified it. But during that time, I was also kind of discovering X-Men, where, again, mixed Japanese and black kid in the hood, not a whole lot of seeing myself in places. And even though I was accepted as a black kid, until something about my difference popped up, like every now and then someone would come up and it'd be like, oh, that's because that's the other side of you or whatever. Would come up. So I couldn't find someone that was like me. Someone had two different colored parents. I wasn't all the way black. And on the weekends, I wasn't Japanese either when I'd go with my Japanese side of the family. So X-Men was a way that I kind of discovered myself, because even though there weren't specifically mixed mutants, there was something about them that made them different, that made them outside of the communities that they were in. And especially since a lot of them discovered their powers when they were about 13, 14, like puberty, that made sense to me. That was clicking into place. And so I found myself in the mutants. And, again, hood kid, no comic book shops, but the spinner racks in the liquor stores had, some of the top characters.
Spinner racks?
Spinner racks are they're just
okay.
But like the Korean liquor store that was in the black neighborhood had a spinner rack, and it had 5 or 6 different comics. And whenever my friends weren't looking at me, I'd grab my little comics and let the Korean lady yell at me, and then I'd buy my comics, hide them in my backpack, and not tell my friends that I was into comics, because I already didn't need another reason to stand out, where I grew up. And turns out we were all black nerds, but none of us could talk about it because we had to be hard. We couldn't be nerds. And so that was how I did it. So I enter with Batman, I jump over to X-Men. X-Men really made me feel myself. And I never really attached to too many other DC characters. I liked Green Lantern because
So, Charmaine, when did you first realize that you had a love for comics?
I don't know how old it was, but I'll say that I entered through Batman, watching like the rerun of the 1969 Batman or 1960s Batman. I was really into. I like the idea of someone choosing to do justice outside of police state. You know, I grew up in Long Beach, so I grew up in the time of the rise of the Vikings, the white police gang that exists in LA and Southern California.
Really?
So they were cops. They all had a tattoo of a Viking image on them, and they basically ran like they were their version of Bloods and Crips. And that's the time period that I'm growing up in Long Beach. And so living in a police state and seeing someone like Batman then was a guy who just wanted to do justice outside of that system. And I think that's kind of the way that I enter comics. And then being a mixed kid in Long Beach, you know, there wasn't a whole lot of ways in which I saw myself. I never saw myself on TV. Occasionally you'd get like a black, white, biracial kid on a show or something like that. And I would kind of try to attach to that, but I don't have a white parent, so it wasn't the same for me. And then I stumbled on X-Men, and for them I related because even though they weren't mixed, something happens to them and they become kind of a different thing from what they were. And that was happening usually during puberty time, and that was making sense to me. That was clicking in. So someone like Jubilee I attached to because even though I'm Japanese and she's Chinese, she was a transracial adoptee. She had white parents.
Right.
So I was like, okay, I have parents who don't look like me. Like, I'm not the same color as either of my parents too, so you know I can kind of get that. And then I saw someone like Storm, and I was just like, that was the person I wanted to be. You know, that was the beauty standard that I had. I wanted to look like her. I wanted to be powerful like her.
You a bad mama jamma if you can manipulate weather.
You know what I'm saying? Like, just, oh gosh, everything about Storm in the beginning. You know. And it was also like, wait, there's black women that are hella stronger than all the dudes on this show? Like, the X-Men cartoon was a thing where like, she was more powerful to me than anybody else on that show. And I, that was it.
Yeah, I mean, no picnic for you is going to rain because I feel like it. I
mean, and then Bishop pops up and is like, wait, that's black time travelers? Like, everything about the X-Men entering through the comics and the TV show gave me a little bit of myself. I got to see black and brown people at least through X-Men, and they were powerful, and I could kind of make some kind of connection to like what I was going through, being an other within every society I enter. I'm not all the way black, so there are times in which that is obvious. Like, usually I'm accepted in blackness, but sometimes not. Sometimes my mixedness comes into play. And as a Japanese kid, I'm not Japanese. You know, like, I'm mixed with Japanese, but even my Japanese family doesn't see me as a Japanese person. They see me as the other thing that I am. And that's a very strong cultural thing with Asians in general. Whatever your other thing is, that's what you are, because you're no longer one of us. And so I've always been an outsider, and I got that with the X-Men.
Right.
I understood how you could like be in a society and be out of the society all at the same time, and that was really the thing that got me. I always liked Batman and all his gadgets, and I definitely got my sense of justice from comics because of people that just wanted to do good despite the fact that people did not want them. That made sense to me, and I needed that because Long Beach in the late 80s, early 90s was no picnic.
So I've heard.
It was no picnic. Yeah.
Now, Mr. Kennedy, what kicked off your love for comics, and what? First off, I want to ask you guys both this question: what universe do you gravitate to, the DC or the Marvel?
Marvel, maybe. Yeah.
Marvel, but Marvel, Batman's in DC.
We'll see. Okay, this is the way to break it down. Marvel is your world as it exists right now, if powered people showed up and how they interact with the world. DC is gods on Earth. Yeah. And the way they protect you is as you are this weak thing that can't survive on your own. So I have to get involved. Superman, I have to get involved. Even Batman being a mere mortal, but he's a rich mortal, I have to get involved. And everybody else is this like sad pathetic thing that I have to protect. On Marvel's side, it's an aid. It's like, you know, this is your neighborhood. I'm trying to help you too.
Right.
That kind of stuff. So there's a lot more social justice. And some of the characters are based off of real life social justice people. So there's that kind of stuff. And even though Marvel has some of its racist problems, they all do, they did better at inclusivity than DC ever did. Right. Well, DC's doing really good right now, but that's a different story.
Real good, yeah. So for me, my journey into comics literally started off pretty much like everybody else who grew up in like the 70s and the 80s. It was old school Batman TV shows, Batman, Hulk, Captain America, Spider-Man, all of the old
Thor,
like 70s and 80s
had
TV
a terrible
shows.
TV show too.
Yeah. And the Saturday morning cartoons, Justice League, Super Friends, and all this stuff. But physical comic books were not introduced to me until I was around about like 8 or 9 years old. It was one day I was sick and I had to stay home from school, which was a real problem for me. But in order to pacify me, my dad brought home this comic books used to come in a 3-pack. Instead of like getting a single issue, they would come in a 3-pack. He brought home a 3-pack issue of The Amazing Spider-Man. Me being a voracious reader, I tore through all 3 of them within 2 days.
More please.
Yeah, more please. And it was then that I realized it's like, oh, the stuff that's like I've been seeing on TV on Saturday mornings, I can actually like, you know, this is a book in book form, and this is amazing. So I got that, and then it went back, you know, to television. So around about like the 80s, it was the X-Men, and I started like, you know, venturing into more different types of comic books. So it went from Spider-Man, looking at other Marvel superheroes like the Falcon, and then Black Panther came along. That to me was incredibly amazing because these happen to be superheroes that not only were regular people, human beings,
right,
but they look like me.
Right.
You know,
right.
until then, it's like all I had to go off of was like Spider-Man, Fantastic Four, and the Justice League, Superman, Batman, Wonder Woman, who didn't look like me.
Right.
Embodied
Right.
some of the characteristics that I embodied, but you didn't look like me. And so Falcon, Black Panther, and then later on in like the 80s and 90s, Static Shock and Milestone Media.
Right.
Completely changed the comic book game for me.
Okay. 2 questions real quick. We've been talking for a second. We're going to get ready to wrap it up.
Okay.
Both of you can answer these questions. How do you think, since the early 2000s, has media and film reintroduced superheroes? Making it cool again, because now everybody seems to be...
Making it cool for the first time, it seems like. I think with Blade, I think it was really important because it's not like there weren't superhero movies before, right? We had Superman with Christopher Reeves. There was that really bad Captain America movie.
Oh yeah.
You know, we had a couple attempts of really bad Hulks and stuff like that. But with Blade, it felt like the real world. I think that's the difference, and maybe that's why Marvel does such a better job than DC, is that it felt like the real world that just so happened to have vampires in it, and then on top of it, black vampire, you know,
vampire hunter.
So I like Blade because he's half.
Yes.
He's mixed, you know, like it's a different type of thing. So I'm watching Blade and I'm like, wait. He's half vampire, half human. That's a mix. I'm one of those. So for Blade was a big deal for me. Plus it was Wesley Snipes and he was the biggest actor at the time, you know, for us and so. And I really loved that, like, he was the only one who could be out in the sun.
Yeah.
And all the white ones couldn't.
A cheater.
And that was stuff like, it was one of those things that was like a subtle messaging to us, where it was just like, see, there's a greatness in melanin.
Yeah, exactly.
And so I think starting with Blade was important because, one, it sets us up kind of at the top of the game, like we're involved, we're a main character, and it was Wesley Snipes. I mean, he's walking around in leather, he's doing the whole thing. When we jump over to X-Men movies after that, they weren't great.
Keep going.
They weren't great, but they were all we had at the time, and so we could get really excited about it. And because they were doing big mainstream actors were popping up in those movies, that gave it a little bit of weight. And through doing those movies, it started making people who weren't fans.
Okay. Last question for both of you. You all introduced me to a book called The New Kid.
Yeah.
That you told me was actually banned by Katy ISD.
Yes.
Katy Independent School District in Katy, Texas.
Right.
Real quick, why do you think that is? To ban literature from children?
Well, so the entire narrative behind their decision to ban the book was because they purported that the book encouraged critical race theory, which, by the way, is an incorrect use of the term and of the subject matter. As an educator in higher learning,
words mean something.
Words mean something, and so when you're talking about critical race theory, you're talking about a college level course, not
in
some
law.
in
the law department.
In the law department, not something that's taught to kids in public school or even private school for that matter.
Yeah.
It's critical race theory is not a grade school level course that children would be taught.
It's not like you have sex ed, health ed,
critical
race therapy.
Yeah, it's not that. So they use that term to encourage or discourage the independent school district from including it in their curriculum.
Excellent. Real quick, why do you think this is? Because you had mentioned something about this is technically fascism.
Yeah, I mean, that's what it is, right? Like in history, wherever books were banned, it was because they needed to control people. So it's not like it hasn't happened in America before, but Nazi Germany, they had all those book burnings. Even in England, it's happened. Here, it's happened. And the idea is like if it doesn't help the lower class or the other toe the line, it doesn't work.
Right.
And so that's why they ban those books. And in this case, we're talking about a black kid in a predominantly white space, and it's going to make white people uncomfortable to learn that they treat black people orderly.
All right. We're going to wrap it up. So real quick, shout out Gulf Coast Cosmos social media and shout out your podcast.
So we are Gulf Coast Cosmos Comic Book Co. We are at GulfCoastCosmos.com on the web, and we're at GCC Comics on all the social media. So it's 3 C's. Make sure you get those 3 C's in there on all the social media. And then for my podcast, it's at Militantly Mixed on all social platforms, at Blurred Comics, BLERDCOMIXED, and By Furious Pod on all the socials.
All right, excellent. I really enjoyed talking with you guys today, and hopefully we get together and chop it up sometime pretty soon because we seem to have a lot in common.
And don't forget to come by the shop located at 2306 Stewart Street, Houston, Texas 77004.